John Matthews had been walking the same trail behind his property in rural Nevada for nearly 15 years. Every morning before work, he would take his dog through the scrubby landscape, following a path that wound between sagebrush and scattered juniper trees. The routine never varied. He would leave through the back gate at 6 in the morning, walk for 30 minutes, then return home to shower and drive to his job at the hardware store in town. On this particular Tuesday in March, the ground was still damp from recent rain, and the desert air carried that clean smell that only comes after a storm. John was thinking about the bills piling up on his kitchen counter, about the truck payment that was due in 3 days, about whether he could pick up extra shifts to cover the gap. He wasn't looking down. He was just walking, lost in worry, when his boot caught on something hard jutting up from the soft earth. John Matthews was 42 years old and had spent most of his adult life working retail jobs that barely covered his expenses. He had moved to Nevada 12 years earlier, after a divorce left him starting over with almost nothing. The property he lived on was inherited from an uncle he had barely known, a small parcel of land with an aging mobile home that needed constant repairs. The inheritance had felt like a gift at the time, but over the years it had become just another source of financial stress. The roof leaked. The plumbing failed regularly. The electrical system was outdated and dangerous. John lived paycheck to paycheck, sometimes picking up weekend work doing odd jobs for neighbors, just to keep the lights on. He had no savings, no retirement account, no safety net of any kind. His ex-wife had moved to Oregon with their daughter, and he sent what child support he could manage, though it was never quite enough, and the guilt ate at him constantly. The hardware store where John worked paid $11 an hour. He had been there for 8 years without a significant raise. His manager was sympathetic, but explained that corporate policy limited wage increases, and John understood that finding another job at his age, with his limited education, would likely mean starting over at minimum wage somewhere else. He drove a 1998 Ford pickup that burned oil and needed new tires. His credit cards were maxed out from emergency expenses over the years. A broken water heater, a hospital visit when he had kidney stones, the time his dog ate something toxic and needed veterinary care that cost $800. John had learned to live with a constant low-level anxiety about money, the kind that makes you check your bank balance multiple times a day and calculate whether you can afford groceries this week or if you need to wait until after payday. The land behind his property was unremarkable. It stretched for acres in every direction, typical high desert terrain that belonged to the Bureau of Land Management. This was open-range country, public land that anyone could use for recreation, though few people did because there was nothing particularly interesting about it. No scenic views, no water features, no reason to visit unless you lived nearby and needed a place to walk. The soil was sandy and pale, dotted with volcanic rock that had been there for thousands of years. Occasionally, John would find arrowheads or pottery shards, remnants of the indigenous people who had lived in the area long before settlers arrived. He kept a small collection of these artifacts on a shelf in his living room, the only decorative items he owned besides a few photographs of his daughter. The property itself had a complicated history that John only partially understood. His uncle had purchased it in the 1970s, during a brief period when land in this part of Nevada was being sold cheaply to encourage development that never materialized. The uncle had planned to retire there, but died unexpectedly of a heart attack at 63, and the property had sat vacant for 2 years before John inherited it. There were old survey maps in a drawer somewhere showing the original boundaries, documents that John had glanced at once when he first moved in, but never examined closely. The mobile home had been placed on the property in the early 80s, and there was evidence of previous structures, concrete foundation pads and rusted metal posts that suggested someone had tried to build something more permanent at some point and given up. When John's boot hit the object in the path, his first thought was that he had kicked a rock. This happened regularly, and he had learned to watch his step because turning an ankle out here alone could be genuinely dangerous. But this felt different. The impact had a metallic quality, a sound that made him stop and look down. His dog, a mixed breed named Copper, was already sniffing at the spot with interest. John crouched down and brushed away loose dirt with his hand. What he saw made him pause. It was definitely metal, darkened with age and corrosion, but clearly man-made. The visible portion was about the size of his palm, rectangular with rounded edges, and it appeared to be the corner of something larger, buried beneath the surface. John glanced around reflexively, though he knew no one else was out here. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away. He felt a strange combination of curiosity and caution. People didn't just bury metal objects in the desert for no reason. His mind went through possibilities: old farm equipment, trash from decades ago, maybe part of a fence post or gate that had been abandoned and gradually covered by shifting soil. He worked his fingers around the edge and pulled gently. It didn't move. Whatever this was, it was either heavy or wedged in tight. John stood up and looked back toward his house, visible in the distance. He was going to be late for work if he didn't leave soon, but something made him stay. He started digging with his hands, scooping away the damp, sandy soil. Copper watched with his head tilted, occasionally stepping forward to sniff at the hole John was creating. The metal object extended deeper than expected. John's fingernails filled with dirt and his hands were soon covered in mud, but he kept going, driven by a growing sense that this was something significant. After several minutes of work, he had exposed what appeared to be a metal box, roughly the size of a car battery, with a hinged lid and a corroded latch. The surface was pitted with rust, but structurally intact. John sat back on his heels, breathing hard from the exertion, and stared at what he had uncovered. His hands were shaking slightly as he worked the latch. It was stuck, frozen by years of corrosion, and he had to use a rock to tap it loose. The sound of metal on metal echoed across the empty landscape. Copper whined softly, sensing John's tension. The latch finally gave way with a grinding sound, and John carefully lifted the lid. The hinges were stiff, but functional. Inside the box, wrapped in what appeared to be old canvas cloth that had partially disintegrated, were objects that gleamed dully in the morning light. John reached in and pulled out the first item, unwrapping the rotted fabric carefully. It was a gold coin, heavy and solid in his palm, with a date he could barely make out. 1876. John's heart was pounding now. He set the coin down carefully on a flat rock and reached back into the box. There were more coins, dozens of them, some loose and some still wrapped in fragments of cloth. Beneath the coins were small leather pouches that crumbled when he touched them, spilling what looked like gold dust and small nuggets. John sat there in the dirt, surrounded by pieces of gold, trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't possible. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. He looked around again, half expecting someone to appear and tell him this was a mistake, that the gold belonged to someone else, that he needed to put it back and walk away. But there was no one. Just the empty desert, the morning sun climbing higher, and this impossible discovery sitting in a hole at his feet. John carefully gathered the coins and pouches, placing them back in the metal box. His mind was racing through questions. Where did this come from? Who buried it? How long had it been here? Was it legal for him to keep it? The last question made him pause. He had no idea what the law said about finding buried treasure on property you owned, or near property you owned, since he wasn't entirely sure if this spot was technically on his land or on the adjacent public land. The property lines out here were vague, marked by old fence posts that had mostly fallen down. John closed the box and tried to think clearly. He needed to get to work. He was already going to be late, and calling in sick would cost him a day's pay he couldn't afford to lose. But leaving this here felt wrong. What if someone else came along? What if the box was visible now that he had disturbed the soil? He made a decision. He would carry it back to his house, hide it somewhere safe, and figure out what to do after work. He lifted the box. It was heavy, easily 40 or 50 pounds, and awkward to carry. John tucked it under one arm and started walking back toward his property, Copper trotting alongside him. The walk back took longer than usual. John had to stop several times to rest his arms, setting the box down carefully each time. His shirt was soaked with sweat, despite the cool morning air. When he finally reached his property, he went straight to the storage shed behind the mobile home, a small wooden structure where he kept tools and lawn equipment. He cleared a space behind some old boxes and set the metal box down, then covered it with a tarp. He stood there for a moment, breathing hard, looking at the concealed box and trying to convince himself this was really happening. John was 2 hours late to work. He told his manager he had car trouble, which was believable given the age of his truck. He spent the entire shift in a distracted fog, ringing up customers and stocking shelves on autopilot, while his mind kept returning to what was hidden in his shed. He made mistakes, gave incorrect change twice, forgot to ask customers if they needed help finding anything. His co-workers noticed and asked if he was feeling okay. John said he was just tired, hadn't slept well. When his shift finally ended at 5 in the afternoon, he drove home faster than usual, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. At home, John went directly to the shed. He pulled back the tarp and opened the metal box again, needing to confirm that what he remembered was real. The coins were still there, gleaming in the dim light filtering through the shed's single small window. John carried the box inside to his kitchen table and spread out the contents carefully. He counted 28 gold coins of various denominations and dates, all from the 1800s. The leather pouches contained approximately 2 pounds of gold dust and small nuggets. John had no expertise in precious metals, but even he could recognize that this was potentially worth a substantial amount of money. He spent the evening researching on his laptop, a cheap device he had bought refurbished years ago. He learned that gold coins from the 1800s, particularly in good condition, could be worth far more than their gold content due to their rarity and historical value. Some of the coins he had found were from the Carson City Mint, which significantly increased their value to collectors. The gold dust and nuggets would be worth whatever the current market price of gold was, which he discovered was approximately $1,900 per ounce. By his rough calculation, just the raw gold content of what he had found was worth somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. The numismatic value of the coins could potentially double or triple that figure. John sat at his kitchen table until well past midnight, the gold spread out in front of him, trying to process the implications. This was more money than he had ever had in his life. This was enough to pay off his debts, fix his truck, repair his house, maybe even start a small savings account. But he was also deeply aware that he had no idea if he was legally entitled to keep it. The gold had been buried on or near his property, but that might not matter. There were laws about treasure troves, laws about mineral rights, laws about archaeological artifacts. John had heard stories about people who found valuable items and then lost them to government seizure or legal battles with previous property owners. He decided he needed professional advice, but he was terrified of telling anyone what he had found. If word got out he could be targeted by thieves. His house had no security system, just basic locks that wouldn't stop a determined intruder. The nearest sheriff's deputy was 30 minutes away. John carefully repacked the gold into the metal box and hid it in a different location, inside his bedroom closet, behind boxes of old clothes. He didn't sleep well that night, waking frequently to check that the box was still there, that he hadn't imagined the entire thing. If you're watching this and thinking about what you would do in John's situation, consider subscribing to Fortune Beneath. We explore real stories of ordinary people who stumbled into extraordinary wealth and the complicated decisions they faced afterward. Every week we bring you new accounts of hidden fortunes discovered in unexpected places and what happened next. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story, because sometimes fortune really is just beneath your feet. The next morning, John called in sick to work. He knew this would cause problems, as he had already been late the previous day, but he couldn't focus on selling screws and paint while sitting on what might be a life-changing discovery. He needed to find out what his legal position was, and he needed to do it carefully. John drove to the county library in town, a small building that offered free internet access and a surprising amount of legal reference materials. He spent hours reading about Nevada treasure trove laws, mineral rights and archaeological protection statutes. What he learned was complicated. In Nevada, generally speaking, if you found treasure on your own property, you had a strong legal claim to keep it. However, if the treasure had archaeological or historical significance, the state could potentially claim it under cultural heritage laws. If the treasure was found on federal land, which the Bureau of Land Management property behind his house technically was, then the federal government had a claim. The exact location of the burial site suddenly became critically important. John needed to determine with certainty whether the spot where he found the metal box was on his property or on public land. John went to the county assessor's office and requested copies of his property survey documents. The clerk was helpful, pulling up records and printing out maps. John spread them on a table and tried to match the survey lines to his mental map of where he had been walking. The property boundaries were irregular, following old fence lines and natural features that had probably shifted over the years. Based on the survey, John believed the burial site was within his property boundaries, but only barely. The margin of error was perhaps 20 or 30 feet, and without a professional surveyor physically marking the exact lines, he couldn't be completely certain. John made another decision. He would hire a surveyor, but he wouldn't tell them why he needed the work done. He would simply say he was considering building a fence and needed to know exactly where his property lines were. He found a surveying company in the phone book and called to request a quote. They could send someone out in 3 days for $500. John agreed, even though $500 represented nearly a week's wages for him. He charged it to a credit card that was already dangerously close to its limit. While waiting for the surveyor, John researched how to value old gold coins. He learned about grading systems, about mint marks and condition factors that affected worth. He carefully examined each of his coins under a magnifying glass, noting details and comparing them to images online. Several of the coins appeared to be in remarkably good condition, protected by their burial in the dry desert soil. John found examples of similar coins that had sold at auction for thousands of dollars each. His excitement grew, but so did his anxiety. The more valuable this turned out to be, the more complicated the legal and practical aspects became. John also started researching how gold discoveries were typically handled. He read about people who had found gold nuggets in California streams and sold them to dealers. He read about metal detector enthusiasts who occasionally found valuable coins and jewelry. He read about the famous cases of buried treasure, the hoards of coins found in walls of old houses, the safe deposit boxes forgotten for decades. In most of these cases, finders had been able to keep their discoveries, but there were also cautionary tales of seizures and lawsuits. John realized he needed to consult with a lawyer, but lawyers cost money he didn't have. The surveyor arrived on schedule, a middle-aged man with expensive equipment and a professional manner. John walked him around the property, pointing out the old fence posts and explaining that he wanted to know the exact boundaries. The surveyor spent several hours setting up instruments and taking measurements, occasionally making notes on a tablet. John tried to appear casually interested rather than desperately anxious. When the work was finished, the surveyor showed John a map with the property lines clearly marked. John's hands were sweating as he looked at the map and tried to locate the spot where he had found the metal box. According to the survey, the burial site was on John's property, approximately 15 feet inside the boundary line. John felt a wave of relief so intense he had to sit down on the tailgate of his truck. The surveyor asked if he was all right, and John said he was fine, just tired from being in the sun. The surveyor packed up his equipment and left, promising to email a detailed report within a few days. John went back into his house and pulled out the metal box again, looking at its contents with a different feeling now. This was his. He had found it on his own property. Whatever legal complexities might exist, he had at least cleared the first major hurdle. John decided he needed to have the gold professionally appraised, but he was still worried about security and discretion. He called several coin dealers in larger cities within driving distance, asking vague questions about their services and how they handled evaluations. Most were located in Reno, about a 2-hour drive from his house. John settled on a dealer who came recommended on online forums for collectors, a business that had been operating for over 30 years and had a reputation for honest dealings. He called and made an appointment, saying only that he had some old coins he wanted to have examined. The drive to Reno felt surreal. John had the metal box on the seat beside him, covered with a jacket. He kept checking his mirrors, irrationally worried he was being followed. The coin dealer's shop was in a modest building in an older part of the city, with bars on the windows and a security camera above the door. John carried the box inside, where a buzzer sounded and a voice from an intercom asked him to wait. After a moment, the door unlocked and John entered a small showroom with display cases of coins and precious metals. The dealer was a man in his 60s named Robert Carr, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful manner of someone who had spent a lifetime evaluating valuable objects. John set the metal box on the counter and explained that he had inherited these items from a relative and wanted to know what they were worth. It was a lie, but a convenient one that explained possession without raising questions. Robert opened the box and his eyebrows rose slightly. He put on a jeweler's loupe and began examining the coins one by one, making notes on a pad. He asked John questions about where the coins had been stored, how long they had been in the family, whether there was any documentation of their origin. John answered vaguely, saying his uncle had collected them years ago and kept them in a safe. The examination took nearly an hour. Robert weighed the gold dust and nuggets on a precise scale, tested the purity with acid, and looked up values in reference books and on his computer. Finally, he removed the loupe and looked at John seriously. He said that what John had brought in was quite valuable. The coins alone, based on their condition and rarity, were worth approximately $90,000 if sold to collectors. The gold dust and nuggets added another $35,000 in raw gold value. Robert said he could facilitate the sale of the coins through auction houses he worked with, taking a 15% commission, or he could buy the entire lot himself for $100,000 cash right now. John's vision actually narrowed for a moment. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. $100,000. It was more than he made in 3 years at the hardware store. It was enough to completely change his life. He asked Robert how long it would take to sell the coins at auction, and Robert explained it could be several months, as the best prices came from specialized numismatic auctions that ran on specific schedules. John thought about his bills, his dying truck, his landlord daughter who deserved better child support. He thought about the fear of waiting months while this treasure sat hidden in his house. He made a decision. He would sell directly to Robert. Robert counted out $100,000 in cash, mostly in $100 bills, which filled 2 bank deposit bags. He provided John with a receipt showing the transaction and a detailed inventory of what had been sold. John signed paperwork confirming he was the legal owner of the items and had the right to sell them. Robert asked again about the provenance, and John stuck to his story about the inheritance. Robert seemed satisfied, though John suspected the dealer had doubts. In the world of rare coins and precious metals, people often preferred not to ask too many questions about where items came from, as long as there was no obvious indication of theft. John drove home with the 2 bags of cash on the passenger seat. He had never seen this much money in physical form. He stopped at his bank and deposited $50,000 into his checking account, keeping the rest in cash for the moment. The bank teller processed the deposit without comment, though she did ask him to fill out additional paperwork because of the amount. John said he had sold some inherited property. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table and made a list of his debts: credit cards, medical bills, the overdue truck payment, back taxes he owed from 3 years ago when he had worked as an independent contractor and failed to pay quarterly estimates. The total came to just over $32,000. The next day, John began paying everything off. He went to the bank and got cashier's checks made out to each creditor. He paid off his credit cards in full, watching the balances drop to 0 with a sense of disbelief. He paid the back taxes, which removed a low-level worry that had haunted him for years. He paid off his truck, which meant he now owned it outright, and immediately took it to a mechanic for all the repairs it needed. Another $2,000, but worth it to have a reliable vehicle. He sent his ex-wife a check for $5,000 to cover all the child support he had missed, with a note saying he had come into some money and wanted to make things right. John then focused on his house. He hired contractors to fix the roof, update the electrical system, and replace the broken plumbing. The work cost $18,000, but when it was finished, he had a home that was actually safe and comfortable. He bought a proper security system with cameras and motion sensors. He opened a savings account and deposited $20,000, more money than he had ever saved in his entire life. He upgraded his laptop and bought some new clothes, small luxuries that felt enormous after years of doing without. Within 6 weeks of finding the buried gold, John's entire financial situation had been transformed. He still worked at the hardware store because he needed health insurance and wanted to maintain some appearance of normalcy. But the constant anxiety about money was gone. He could buy groceries without calculating costs. He could fill his gas tank without worrying about whether he would have enough to last until payday. He could see a doctor about the chronic back pain he had been ignoring for 2 years because he couldn't afford the copay. The psychological relief of financial security was almost overwhelming. John told no one about the discovery. When co-workers commented that he seemed different, happier, he said he had just been dealing with some personal issues that had resolved themselves. When his ex-wife called to ask about the unexpected check, he gave the same vague explanation about inheriting some items from a relative and selling them. He knew that telling people would only invite questions he didn't want to answer, and possibly put him at risk. The gold discovery remained his secret, but John did think a lot about how the gold had ended up buried on his property. He researched the history of the area, looking for clues. He learned that in the 1870s, this part of Nevada had been active with mining operations. Prospectors had worked claims throughout the region, and some had struck it rich while others had gone bust. There had been a small settlement about 5 miles from his current property, a place called Silver Creek that was now completely abandoned, just ruins and foundations visible if you knew where to look. John speculated that someone from that era had buried the gold for safekeeping and then died or disappeared before retrieving it, or perhaps someone had stolen it and hidden it, planning to return later, but never did. He went back to the spot where he had found the metal box and searched more carefully, wondering if there might be additional items buried nearby. He bought a basic metal detector and spent several weekends scanning the area, but found nothing except the usual desert debris, old cans and bits of wire and rusted farm equipment. If there had been more treasure, it was either gone or buried too deep to detect. John eventually accepted that his discovery had been a singular piece of luck, a one-time event that had changed his trajectory. John also thought about what the gold represented beyond its monetary value. Someone had worked hard to acquire it, panning for gold in streams or digging in mines, accumulating wealth in an era when that meant back-breaking labor and significant risk. They had valued it enough to bury it carefully, protecting it in a metal box and wrapping the coins in cloth. They had intended to come back for it. The fact that they never did suggested tragedy of some kind, death or disaster or circumstances that made retrieval impossible. John felt a strange sense of responsibility to that unknown person, to use their saved wealth in a way that mattered. He decided to use some of the money to visit his daughter in Oregon. They had been estranged for years, communication limited to awkward phone calls and missed birthdays. John flew to Portland, rented a car, and drove to the small town where his ex-wife and daughter lived. His daughter was 19 now, attending community college and working part-time at a coffee shop. John took her to dinner and apologized for years of being absent and broke and unable to provide the support she had needed. He gave her a check for $10,000, money for school or whatever she needed. His daughter cried, and they talked for hours, beginning the slow process of rebuilding their relationship. John returned to Nevada feeling like he had accomplished something meaningful. The gold had given him more than financial stability. It had given him the opportunity to address failures and make amends. He continued working at the hardware store, but picked up fewer extra shifts, giving himself more time to rest and think about what he wanted from life. He considered going back to school, maybe learning a trade that paid better than retail. He thought about moving to a place with more opportunities, though he felt a strange attachment to the property now, knowing what it had yielded. The metal box itself, empty now of its contents, sat on a shelf in John's closet. He kept it as a reminder of the morning that had changed everything. Sometimes he would take it down and look at it, running his fingers over the corroded metal and thinking about the journey it had made through time. From someone's hands in the 1800s to burial in the desert to rediscovery more than a century later, this object had outlasted its owner and fulfilled its purpose in a way no one could have predicted. The box had protected its contents through decades of weather and geological shifts, keeping the gold safe until someone stumbled upon it by pure chance. John wondered how many other treasures were buried in remote places, forgotten by time, and waiting for someone to literally stumble over them. The desert around his property was vast, thousands of acres of land that had seen human activity for centuries, but was now largely empty. Prospectors, settlers, ranchers, outlaws, all of them had passed through this region, and some of them had surely buried valuable items for various reasons. Most of those caches would never be found, would remain hidden forever, their stories lost. John had been extraordinarily lucky, in the right place at the right moment, with just enough curiosity to investigate instead of walking past. The experience also made John more attentive to his surroundings in general. He found himself noticing details he had previously overlooked, looking at the landscape with fresh eyes. He wondered about the other artifacts he had found over the years, the arrowheads and pottery shards he had collected casually. Were any of them valuable? Should he have them examined by experts? He didn't pursue this thought seriously, as he had no interest in becoming a treasure hunter or changing his life more dramatically than he already had, but it shifted his perception of value and worth. John's story eventually became known in a limited way, though not through his own telling. His ex-wife mentioned to a friend that John had come into money somehow, and that friend told others, and rumors began circulating in the small community where John lived. People speculated that he had won the lottery, or received an inheritance, or been involved in something illegal. John deflected questions, said he had sold some family items, and the gossip eventually faded as people moved on to other topics. But he was aware that his changed circumstances were visible: the repaired house and reliable truck, and absence of the financial stress that had previously defined him. One afternoon at the hardware store, an older man came through John's checkout line buying supplies for a mining claim he was working. They got to talking, and the man mentioned that he had been prospecting in Nevada for 40 years without ever making a significant find. He said most people didn't realize that there was still gold in the ground, still fortunes waiting to be discovered, but that finding them required incredible persistence and luck. John listened and thought about his own discovery, about the fact that he had found more gold in one morning than this dedicated prospector had found in 4 decades. The randomness of fortune struck him as profound. The money in John's savings account earned a small amount of interest, not much, but more than he had ever accumulated before. He watched the balance grow incrementally and felt a sense of security that was entirely new. He set up automatic transfers, putting a small amount from each paycheck into savings, building on the foundation the gold had provided. He met with a financial advisor, something he never would have considered before, and learned about retirement accounts and investment options. The advisor suggested he diversify, not keep everything in a simple savings account, and John followed this guidance cautiously, moving some money into low-risk mutual funds. John also made improvements to his daily life that had nothing to do with money directly, but everything to do with the peace of mind that financial security provided. He started exercising regularly, taking longer walks with his dog and feeling his health improve. He slept better at night, no longer lying awake calculating bills and worrying about unexpected expenses. He reconnected with old friends he had drifted away from during his years of poverty, people he had avoided because he couldn't afford to go out or do activities. He discovered that without the constant weight of financial stress, he was more patient, more present, more able to enjoy simple moments. There were adjustments that took time. John had spent so many years living frugally that he found it difficult to spend money even when he had it. He would stand in stores holding items he wanted and needed, arguing with himself about whether the purchase was justified. He had internalized messages about scarcity that didn't disappear just because his bank balance had changed. Gradually, he learned to give himself permission to buy things that improved his quality of life, to spend money on experiences and comforts without guilt. It was a process of unlearning habits that had been necessary for survival but were no longer required. John thought often about the randomness of his discovery. If he had walked a slightly different path that morning, if the rain hadn't eroded the soil just enough to expose the corner of the metal box, if his boot had landed a few inches to the left or right, he would never have found the gold. His life would have continued on its previous trajectory of financial struggle and limited options. The difference between his current reality and that alternative was literally a matter of inches and timing. This awareness made him both grateful and somewhat unsettled, recognizing how much of life comes down to chance events beyond our control. He also thought about the person who had buried the gold, whoever they were. John imagined a prospector in the 1870s, working a claim in the harsh Nevada desert, slowly accumulating gold dust and coins through grueling labor. He imagined that person deciding to bury their wealth for safekeeping, perhaps planning to retrieve it later, when they moved to a more settled location. He imagined something going wrong, an accident or illness or violence, something that prevented them from ever returning. Their life's work had remained hidden for over a century, until a man walking his dog happened to kick a metal box jutting from the ground after a rainstorm. Before we continue with what John did next, I want to remind you that Fortune Beneath brings you these real accounts of discovered wealth every week. If you're fascinated by stories of gold, hidden money, and lives transformed by unexpected fortune, make sure you're subscribed. We dig deep into the details other channels skip, bringing you the complete story of how ordinary people's lives change when they stumble onto extraordinary wealth. Hit that subscribe button now, because you never know when the next amazing discovery might happen. John eventually told one person the full story of his discovery, a woman named Sarah he met at a community event 6 months after finding the gold. Sarah was a teacher at the local elementary school, divorced with 2 children, and she and John began dating casually. As their relationship developed and became more serious, John realized he couldn't maintain a significant secret from someone he was building trust with. One evening at his house, he showed her the metal box and explained exactly what had happened. Sarah's reaction was a mix of amazement and concern. She was thrilled for John that his financial situation had improved so dramatically, but she worried about the legal implications and whether he might still face problems. John showed her the property survey documents and the receipt from the coin dealer, evidence that he had tried to handle everything properly. Sarah suggested he consult with a lawyer anyway, just to ensure he had covered all bases, and John agreed this was wise. They found an attorney who specialized in property law and paid for a consultation. The lawyer reviewed John's documentation and asked detailed questions about the discovery. After careful consideration, the lawyer's opinion was that John had handled the situation reasonably well. The gold had been found on his property, which gave him a strong claim. He had not concealed the sale from tax authorities. The bank deposit and dealer receipt created a paper trail that proved the transaction. The main risk was if someone came forward claiming prior ownership of the gold, but given that it had been buried for over a century, this seemed unlikely. The lawyer advised John to file the income from the gold sale on his taxes as treasure trove income, which is taxable under federal law. This introduced a complication John had not fully considered. The $100,000 from the gold sale was taxable income. At his income level after deductions, he would owe approximately $22,000 in federal taxes, plus several thousand more in state taxes. John was devastated by this realization. He had already spent a significant portion of the money paying off debts and making repairs. He had enough left to cover the tax bill, but it would substantially reduce his remaining cushion. The lawyer explained that there was no way around this. Treasure trove was explicitly taxable, and failing to report it could result in serious penalties if discovered. John filed his taxes properly, reporting the treasure trove income and paying what he owed. It hurt to write that check to the IRS, watching a quarter of his windfall disappear, but he understood it was necessary. The alternative was living with the fear of an audit and potential criminal charges for tax evasion. Sarah helped him think through the situation, pointing out that even after taxes, he was still far better off than he had been before the discovery. She was right, but John felt the loss of that money keenly, thinking about all the things he could have done with another $25,000. The tax situation was a reminder that windfalls come with complications. John had read stories about lottery winners who went bankrupt because they didn't properly manage their sudden wealth or account for the tax implications. He had tried to be smarter than that, but he had still made the mistake of spending money before fully understanding his obligations. The lesson was expensive, but valuable. In future, John would consult professionals before making major financial decisions, even when the situation seemed straightforward. John and Sarah's relationship continued to develop, and she became a steadying presence in his life. Sarah had never been interested in John because of money. She had been attracted to his kindness and sense of humor, qualities that had nothing to do with his financial status. But she appreciated that the gold discovery had relieved John of the stress that had been wearing him down. She saw him become more relaxed, more confident, more able to think about the future instead of just surviving the present. Sarah told John that she thought the gold had found him at exactly the right moment, when he needed it most, and was ready to use it wisely. John's daughter visited during summer break, spending 2 weeks at his house. The relationship between them had improved significantly since John's visit to Oregon, and the financial support he had provided. His daughter was impressed by the repairs he had made to the house, the sense of stability he had created. They spent time together doing simple things, hiking in the desert where John had made his discovery, cooking meals, watching movies. John told her the full story of finding the gold, and she listened with fascination, asking questions about what the coins looked like and how he had felt in that moment. She said she was proud of him for handling everything responsibly and for using the money to fix his life rather than wasting it. One afternoon, John took his daughter to the exact spot where he had found the metal box. The hole had long since filled in with wind-blown soil, and there was no visible evidence of the excavation. They stood there together, and John's daughter tried to imagine what it must have been like to uncover something so valuable in such an ordinary place. She asked if John had gone back to searching, if he had hoped to find more treasure. John said he had looked briefly, but had come to accept that his discovery had been a singular event. His daughter said that was probably for the best, that searching obsessively would have turned something magical into something compulsive. John continued working at the hardware store for another year after finding the gold. He had considered quitting, but he realized he actually liked the job, the routine and social interaction and sense of purpose. What had made it unbearable before was the stress of trying to survive on inadequate wages. Now that he had financial security, the work became something he chose rather than something he had to endure. His manager eventually promoted him to assistant manager with a modest raise, recognizing his reliability and experience. John accepted, though the extra money meant far less to him now than it would have a year earlier. Sarah and John moved in together, combining households to save money and build their life together. Sarah sold her rental house and used the proceeds to pay off her student loans, finally clearing debt that had followed her for 15 years. They bought a better vehicle, a used SUV that could safely transport Sarah's children. They took a vacation together, the first real vacation John had taken in over a decade, spending a week in California visiting national parks. The trip cost $3,000, money John would never have spent before the gold discovery, but the memories and experience felt worth far more than the cost. Life settled into a new normal for John, one defined by security rather than scarcity. He no longer checked his bank balance obsessively or worried about unexpected expenses. When his truck needed a repair, he simply took it to a mechanic. When Sarah's daughter needed money for a school trip, they could provide it without stress. The constant low-level anxiety that had characterized John's previous life was gone, replaced by a sense of possibility and control. He realized that what he had gained was not just money, but freedom. The freedom to make choices based on what he wanted rather than what he could afford. John occasionally thought about what would have happened if he had never found the gold. He would still be struggling, still working long hours for insufficient pay, still barely managing to keep his head above water financially. The version of himself that existed in that alternative timeline seemed like a different person now, someone trapped in circumstances that felt increasingly distant. The gold had created a before and after in John's life, a clear dividing line between who he had been and who he was becoming. The discovery also changed John's perspective on value and worth. He had always believed that financial success came from hard work and discipline, that people who struggled financially must be failing to do something right. His own experience had taught him that luck played an enormous role, that someone could work hard their entire life and remain poor through no fault of their own, while someone else could stumble over a fortune purely by chance. This realization made John more compassionate toward people who were struggling, less inclined to judge or assume they weren't trying hard enough. He knew firsthand that circumstances mattered more than effort in many cases. John and Sarah eventually married in a small ceremony, attended by family and close friends. They used some of John's remaining savings to buy a better piece of property, a few acres with a solid house and room for Sarah's children to play safely. The mobile home and original property were sold to a young couple just starting out, and John felt good about passing on the place that had changed his life, even if the new owners would never know its significance. The metal box came with John to the new house, still kept on a shelf in his closet as a reminder. Years passed. John advanced to store manager at the hardware store, a position that came with better pay and benefits. Sarah continued teaching, finding fulfillment in her work with children. They built a stable, comfortable life together, raising Sarah's children and maintaining a relationship with John's daughter, who eventually moved back to Nevada after finishing college. The gold discovery became a story they told occasionally, usually when someone asked how they had managed to buy their house or how John had paid off his debts. The story always generated amazement and questions, people wondering what they would do in a similar situation. John never forgot the feeling of that morning, the moment when his boot hit something metal and his life changed forever. He never took his current security for granted, always aware of how easily he could have missed the discovery entirely. He remained grateful in a way that shaped his daily life, appreciating small comforts and opportunities that he once would have overlooked. The gold had given him a second chance, an opportunity to rebuild from a position of strength rather than desperation, and he was determined not to waste it. The desert behind his new property looked much like the desert behind his old property, the same scrubby landscape and volcanic rock, the same sense of vast emptiness. Sometimes John would walk out there with his dog, following no particular path, just moving through the landscape and thinking about buried treasure and chance encounters. He never found anything else of value, but he wasn't really looking. The discovery had been enough. It had changed his trajectory and given him the resources to build a life he actually wanted. That single morning, that accidental kick of a metal box hidden just beneath the surface had been worth more than any amount of deliberate searching could have yielded. John's story is a reminder that fortune can be hidden anywhere, waiting for the right moment and the right person to uncover it. The gold that changed his life had been buried for over a century, surviving weather and geological changes, patiently existing until someone happened to walk a particular path on a particular day. The value was always there, but it took an accident to reveal it. How many other treasures are buried in unlikely places, their existence unknown even to the people who own the land above them? How many fortunes remain hidden, not through elaborate concealment, but simply through the passage of time and the randomness of discovery? What John found was not just gold, but possibility, the material resources to escape a cycle of struggle and build something better. The coins and nuggets represented months or years of labor by someone in the 1800s, value that had waited in darkness until it could serve a new purpose. John became the unexpected heir to someone else's saved wealth, a stranger across more than a century of time. The original owner never retrieved their hidden fortune, but it fulfilled its purpose anyway, providing security and opportunity to someone who desperately needed both. If you've made it this far in John's story, you understand why Fortune Beneath focuses on these detailed accounts of discovered wealth. Every treasure has a story, every discovery changes a life in ways both obvious and subtle. We bring you these complete narratives because the details matter, the financial specifics matter, the human impact matters. Subscribe to Fortune Beneath if you haven't already, and join us as we explore more stories of ordinary people whose lives were transformed by extraordinary finds. Sometimes the fortune you need is already there, just beneath your feet, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The metal box that held John's treasure now sits empty on a shelf, an artifact of corroded metal that once protected great value. John occasionally takes it down and holds it, feeling the weight of history and chance in his hands. The box served its purpose twice, first protecting gold through decades of burial, then revealing itself at precisely the right moment to save a man from a life of financial struggle. Objects can carry significance beyond their physical form, becoming markers of transformation and reminders of possibility. For John, the empty box represents everything that changed, everything that became possible when he took a morning walk and happened to kick something hard jutting from the soft earth after a rain.